September 9th, 1943. The Gulf of Salerno roared with thunder not born of weather but of war. Naval guns flashed from Allied ships anchored off the coast, their booming fire shaking the hills that rolled down to the beaches. Italian civilians crouched in cellars, hands pressed over the ears of their children, whispering prayers that sounded more desperate than faithful. To them, the promise of liberation was tangled with dread. For years, fascist propaganda had painted the Americans as brutes, gangsters who would loot and ravage, men who carried wealth in one hand and cruelty in the other. The Germans, in their retreat, had seized livestock, looted grain, and blown bridges, leaving only hunger and ruins. The word spreading through villages now, "Gli Americani sono qui," was not reassurance but a warning. Mothers feared for their daughters. Farmers hid what little food remained. In the narrow streets of Salerno, faces pale with exhaustion peered from shuttered windows, waiting to see if the arrival of the Allies would be another calamity. The first sight of the soldiers confirmed fears, at least in part. Waves of men in mud-smeared uniforms splashed ashore under fire, rifles clenched in their hands, helmets low over their eyes. Tanks rattled inland, their tracks churning the earth while the air shivered with the scream of Luftwaffe planes. Civilians stayed hidden, counting each explosion and bracing for soldiers to kick down doors. For generations, foreign armies had marched through Italy and taken what they pleased. Why should this time be different? Yet amid the din of battle, a quieter, stranger scene unfolded. In a small courtyard near the harbor, a group of children emerged from hiding once the shelling subsided. They were barefoot, their knees scabbed, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. They looked at the soldiers with the wary stillness of stray dogs. The GIs, boys themselves, many no older than 20, paused. One of them, Private Frank D'Angelo of Brooklyn, recognized the Sicilian dialect of a boy whispering to his sister. His parents had spoken the same tongue at home. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, reached into his pack, and pulled out a dented tin. Spam. With the twist of a key, he opened it, the salty scent rising in the air. He crouched, offered it with an open hand. The boy hesitated, staring as if it might be a trick. Then gently he reached out and took it. His teeth sank into the soft meat, and his eyes widened. The girl bit next, her face breaking into disbelief. Word spread quickly, as word always does in hungry towns. Other civilians began to creep from their cellars, blinking in the sunlight. They saw Americans not tearing bread from their hands, but handing out their own rations. Tins of corned beef hash, packets of hardtack crackers, even chocolate bars that seemed like relics from another world. A woman wept as she cradled a biscuit given to her by a young soldier, whispering that she had not tasted wheat in months. An old man crossed himself when a GI poured steaming coffee into a tin cup and pressed it into his hands. The soldiers laughed, embarrassed, as children swarmed them for candy. What the Italians did not know was that these very rations were the bane of many GIs. Spam mocked in letters home, the biscuits cursed for breaking teeth. Yet to those who had survived on thin soup and potato peels, they were a feast. The irony deepened the shock. Only days before, Germans had marched through the same streets, demanding food under threat of bayonet. They had taken hams from smokehouses, wine from cellars, chickens from coops. Now the supposed enemies, the Americans, were giving rather than seizing. For civilians who had spent years taught to expect barbarity, the gesture felt surreal, as though reality itself had broken. It was not the sight of tanks that undid them, nor the rumble of jeeps, but the quiet exchange of food, the unmistakable sign of mercy. Private D'Angelo, still crouched by the boy and girl, found himself staring into their faces. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Brooklyn, where pasta and bread had always been on the table, even in the lean years of the Depression. He wondered what his mother would say if she saw him here, feeding children who spoke the same dialect she had sung lullabies in. Around him, other GIs began mimicking the gesture, trading rations for smiles, awkwardly repeating words they barely understood: pain, bambino, grazie. The clash of armies, the grinding machine of war, all of it shrank in that courtyard to something profoundly human. Still, beneath the laughter and the wonder, there lingered tension. The Italians were not naive. They had seen kindness before turn to cruelty with the change of a uniform. Could this generosity be trusted? Would it last once the front moved deeper into the countryside? For the civilians, the uncertainty gnawed as sharply as hunger. For the soldiers, the war was far from won. Machine gun fire still rattled in the hills, and German counterattacks threatened to push the Allies back into the sea. The exchange of rations was a momentary oasis in a landscape of fire. Yet moments concede something larger. A boy's first bite of Spam. A girl licking melted chocolate from her fingers. An old man's sigh as hot coffee warmed his throat. These images lingered, binding themselves to memory. For the Italians, they suggested a different kind of invader. One who might, impossibly, bring not ruin, but relief. For the GIs, they revealed a war that was not only about defeating an enemy, but about proving, even to strangers, that America carried more than weapons overseas. Night fell on Salerno with the smell of smoke still in the air, but also the faint scent of frying meat from tins opened and shared. Families huddled in their ruined homes, whispering that perhaps these Americans were not the monsters they had been told of. On the beaches, GIs lay in foxholes, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, thinking of the faces they had seen, the gratitude they had received for food they had cursed only hours before. Hunger in southern Italy was not a passing discomfort in 1943. It was a constant shadow, shaping every hour of every day. In the years before the Americans arrived, fascist rationing had stripped cupboards bare, and the German retreat had stolen the last reserves. A family might live on a heel of bread stretched across 3 meals, or a watery broth where 1 potato flavored an entire pot. Children's hair turned thin and brittle. Their eyes carried a dullness too old for their years. In Naples, mothers bartered wedding rings for flour. Fathers sold boots for a single onion. It was not unusual for a grandmother to go without supper, pretending she had already eaten, so the youngest in the house could gnaw on the last crust. When the Allies landed, civilians were not thinking of flags or politics. They were thinking of bread. The Americans, too, thought often of food, though from another angle. Their C-Rations were predictable, monotonous, and cursed in letters home. Spam was ridiculed, powdered coffee scorned, biscuits mocked for their hardness. Soldiers joked that they could use the cans as armor. Yet when these very items entered Italian hands, the tone shifted entirely. To the civilians, Spam was savory and rich. Chocolate was a miracle, and the hard biscuits, softened in coffee, tasted like luxuries. The irony was almost comical. What American soldiers despised was, to hungry Italians, as rare and precious as gold. Take, for example, Lucia, a widow from Salerno whose husband had been conscripted and lost on the Russian front. She had 2 children clinging to her skirt the morning she saw GIs handing out rations in the square. At first she stood apart, ashamed of her hunger, wary of begging, but when a young soldier noticed her, he held out a tin of corned beef hash, smiling awkwardly, unsure if she would accept. She hesitated, pride and desperation warring within her, then reached for it with trembling hands. That night she warmed it over the coals and fed her children, their eyes brightening at the greasy richness. She herself ate little, savoring the scent more than the taste. For years afterward, she told neighbors that it was the first night she felt hope return. Memory is sharpened by hunger, and the foods the Americans gave carried emotional weight far beyond calories. Decades later, men and women would still recall their first Hershey bar, the bitter sweetness of real chocolate melting on the tongue after years without sugar. One boy, Antonio, swore that he could still smell the faint waxy wrapper when he was an old man, long after the war. Another woman remembered tasting coffee, real coffee, not roasted chickpeas passed off as beans, for the first time since childhood. The aroma filled her kitchen like a hymn. These were not just flavors, but markers of survival. Moments where the gray fog of war parted and revealed something human, almost sacred. The GIs, for their part, found themselves pulled into relationships they had not anticipated. Food became the first language of connection. A soldier who handed a biscuit to a child was rewarded with a smile brighter than any victory ribbon. Men who thought themselves hardened by combat softened when a grandmother kissed their hands in gratitude. Bonds were formed in those exchanges, fragile yet enduring. Letters written home began to mention not only battles but also the kids who wait for us when we come down the street, or The old lady who makes us taste her bread after we give her spam. War, which seemed to grind down all individuality, suddenly allowed space for personal stories, intimate connections between occupier and civilian. Still, beneath these gestures ran a vein of suspicion and fear. Many Italians whispered that generosity could not be trusted. They remembered how German soldiers had at times smiled before seizing livestock, or punishing families suspected of aiding partisans. Could these Americans be any different? Were the chocolates only a mask for something darker? This unease lingered in every handshake, every shared meal. Lucia herself confessed to hiding part of her ration tin in the garden, in case the soldiers returned demanding it back. Trust was slow to root in soil that had seen so much betrayal. Yet as the weeks passed, the pattern repeated. GIs consistently gave, and civilians consistently received. Exchanges grew warmer, more familiar. Children began to wait outside billets, eager for candy. Farmers started offering eggs or fresh bread in return for tins. In back alleys, soldiers and civilians haggled cheerfully, trading spam for homemade wine, biscuits for olives. These interactions stitched together a fragile but growing trust. War had stripped both sides of normal life. Yet here, through food, they began to rebuild a semblance of it. There were moments of humor that became legends in themselves. One soldier, eager to impress locals, tried to explain how to cook spam, only to have an Italian woman laugh and stir it straight into a pot of pasta, transforming the despised meat into something almost delicious. Another story tells of children offering soldiers chestnuts in exchange for chewing gum, then laughing at the strange sight of Americans blowing bubbles. These moments, small and absurd, chipped away at fear more effectively than speeches or proclamations. And yet, hunger never truly disappeared. Even as GIs gave freely, there was never enough to erase years of deprivation. Families still went to bed hungry, still rationed every crumb, still feared what winter would bring. For civilians, the kindness of soldiers was a blessing, but not a guarantee of survival. For the Americans, it was a reminder of the stakes of the war, that behind every battle line lay villages where the people's suffering was not measured in front-page victories, but in empty stomachs. One evening, as dusk fell over Salerno, Private D'Angelo once again found himself in the courtyard with the same children who had first taken spam from his hands. They looked healthier now, or at least less hollow. He handed them chocolate and watched their eyes shine. But when he glanced up, he noticed their mother, Lucia, watching from the doorway. Her expression was complicated, gratitude mixed with something harder, more guarded. She had seen soldiers come and go before. She knew kindness could fade, that war could twist even gentle men into cruel shapes. Her eyes seemed to ask the question the whole town whispered: is this real or only temporary? The children laughed, sticky fingers clutching sweets. The soldiers smiled, embarrassed and shy. But between Lucia and D'Angelo, silence stretched, heavy with the weight of history and uncertainty. It was not enough to give food. What mattered now was whether these small gestures would survive the storm of war, or vanish like smoke once the front moved north. And in that quiet courtyard, with night pressing close and artillery rumbling in the distance, the fragile bond between occupier and occupied trembled, uncertain if it could hold. The war pressed forward, but life in the villages behind the lines began to gather strange new rhythms, shaped not only by hunger, but by the odd, almost comic collisions of two very different worlds. In Salerno and Naples, narrow streets filled with the smell of wood smoke and rubble also carried new scents. Fried spam sizzling in pans, cigarettes curling in doorways, and the sweet, almost medicinal tang of American chocolate melting in children's hands. What had begun as a gesture of survival now evolved into something less predictable, a daily mingling of cultures, clumsy, awkward, and often tinged with laughter. The Americans were young men far from home, armed not only with rifles but with habits that puzzled the Italians. They chewed gum constantly, jaws moving in rhythm as if it were a secret language. Children followed them in flocks, begging for a piece, then laughing hysterically as they learned to blow bubbles. Mothers frowned, shaking their heads at what seemed wasteful, until one boy popped a gum bubble with such pride that even the sternest grandmother had to laugh. To Italians, gum was strange and frivolous. To GIs, it was a staple as natural as bread. In that small difference, Both sides saw how foreign the other truly was. Coffee was another bridge and barrier. The GIs carried powdered Nescafé in their kits, a pale imitation of what Italians considered true coffee. Soldiers would brew it in tin cups, sipping it black and bitter, while locals watched with a mixture of horror and pity. When an old Neapolitan man invited two soldiers into his ruined home, he insisted on making real espresso over a battered stovetop, thick as ink, and served in tiny chipped cups. The Americans nearly gagged at the strength, while the host chuckled, muttering that these giants who stormed beaches could not conquer a proper coffee. Laughter softened the insult, and soon the soldiers were slapping his back, promising to train themselves in Italian ways. Food itself became the most obvious point of cultural comedy. GIs attempted to impress villagers by demonstrating how to prepare spam or stew from their rations, often met with skepticism. One memorable evening, Lucia, still wary yet increasingly drawn into this new world, took a can of spam from Private D'Angelo and sliced it into a pot of pasta she had salvaged from neighbors. The soldiers leaned in nervously, uncertain how the mix would taste. When she served it steaming and fragrant, the pasta transformed the much-maligned meat into something delicious, almost celebratory. Soldiers roared with approval, declaring that the Italians could make even army food taste like a feast. Lucia, for the first time in years, allowed herself a smile that was not tinged with sorrow. The children absorbed everything with reckless speed. They mimicked the English words shouted by patrols. "Okay, move," running through alleys, pretending to be soldiers. They swapped their wooden toys for empty ration tins, banging them like drums, parading as if they too were part of this unstoppable army. Soldiers laughed, tossing them helmets too big for their heads or belts they no longer needed. For these children, war was still a game, and though the ruins around them told another story, the Americans became characters in their play. Not all encounters were light. Cultural gaps sometimes deepened into misunderstandings. When soldiers offered canned peaches to a family, the mother at first refused, suspecting they were spoiled or laced with something harmful. Only after seeing a GI slurp one straight from the can did she relent, cautiously feeding them to her children, who squealed at the syrupy sweetness. Trust once more had to be tasted before it could be believed. On another occasion, a soldier tried to gift chewing tobacco, thinking it generous. The horrified recipient spat it out, convinced it was poison. Both sides laughed afterward, but the tension of not knowing what to expect never fully vanished. Music also wove its way into the streets. Soldiers carried harmonicas, sometimes strumming guitars salvaged from wrecked homes. At night they sang American songs under broken balconies, their voices rough but heartfelt. Italians listened, confused by the strange rhythms yet moved by the emotion. In return, villagers sang folk songs of the South, melancholy ballads of sea and land. Though neither side understood the words, the melodies needed no translation. These nights, fleeting as they were, carried an intimacy the war itself seemed unable to destroy. Humor, however, remained the sharpest blade against despair. One GI, lanky and earnest, tried to ask for directions in broken Italian, mixing words until he accidentally proposed marriage to a grandmother who slapped his arm in mock outrage. Another soldier, unfamiliar with local customs, tried to buy wine with military scrip, and ended up bartering with socks instead. Children howled with laughter at these mistakes, repeating the mispronounced words until soldiers themselves joined in, their embarrassment dissolving in the chorus of mirth. Lucia, who had once watched the soldiers with suspicion, found herself caught between wariness and reluctant gratitude. Her children adored the GIs, rushing to greet them for candy or biscuits. She worried about their innocence, about what would happen when the soldiers moved north and hunger returned. Yet she also recognized that something had shifted. For years, survival had been silent, gray, and joyless. Now, her children's laughter echoed against ruined walls. Strange foreign songs drifted through the night, and even the bitter spam could be turned into a dish worth savoring. She resisted, but she also softened, as though the weight she carried was not quite as heavy in these moments. For the Americans, the bond carried its own lessons. They had come to Italy expecting suspicion, perhaps hostility. Instead, they discovered resilience wrapped in warmth, a people who could laugh even when surrounded by ruins. Many wrote home, not about victories on the battlefield, but about the kids who chase us for candy, or the lady who made us pasta with Spam. For some, these memories would outlast the noise of guns. They realized that the war was not only about defeating Germans, but about proving to themselves and to those they met that they carried something worth fighting for. Still, beneath the humor, the central unease endured. The Italians asked themselves if this kindness would last once the fighting intensified again. Could trust in foreign soldiers survive air raids, hunger, and the cold march of war? Lucia, staring at her children's faces sticky with chocolate, wondered if their laughter was fragile, destined to vanish like smoke. Private D'Angelo, watching her from across the square, wondered the same thing, whether their fragile bond, built on food and laughter, could withstand the brutal tide waiting beyond the next hill. As autumn nights grew colder, the songs, the meals, and the laughter carried on, but so did the war. Rumors spread of battles further north, of German counterattacks, of villages caught in the crossfire. In the warmth of fire-lit kitchens, it was easy to believe the new bond was real, that generosity and humor might triumph over suspicion. Yet each distant rumble of artillery reminded them of the truth. The war was not done, and the fragile bridge they had built might yet be shattered in an instant. Trust. In 1943, Italy was not given freely. It had been stripped away by years of hunger, broken promises, and soldiers who had smiled with one hand and stolen with the other. And yet, in the ruined courtyards of Salerno and Naples, something fragile began to grow. It was not written in treaties or announced in speeches. It lived in the quiet space where an American GI pressed a ration tin into the hands of a child, or where a widow stirred Spam into pasta and called it supper. These were not grand gestures, but small, stubborn acts of humanity, repeated until disbelief slowly gave way to faith. Lucia, who had once watched the strangers with suspicion, began to see them differently. Her children rushed out every morning, their voices bright with anticipation, and returned with sticky fingers and chocolate-stained cheeks. She worried for their innocence, but she could not deny the glow in their eyes, a glow she had not seen since her husband marched away to a war he would never return from. One evening, she invited Private D'Angelo into her home, a crumbling room where smoke-blackened walls bore witness to years of hardship. She poured him a small glass of wine saved for feast days, and in return, he laid out a bar of chocolate on the table as though it were treasure. Neither spoke much of the other's language, but they did not need to. In the shared silence, the clink of glass and the snap of chocolate carried its own eloquence. Other households followed. Soldiers were invited into kitchens, sometimes to share a meal, sometimes simply to sit among the warmth of family. They offered biscuits or cigarettes in exchange for eggs or bread, a barter that transcended currency. Children carried stories back and forth. This soldier's name is Joe. That one sings with a harmonica. Another taught them to say thank you in English. These threads, woven day by day, began to stitch together a new fabric of trust. Where once a knock at the door meant danger, it now often meant the promise of food, laughter, or music. The memory of German occupation lingered like a scar. Families remembered soldiers marching into their barns, seizing livestock, and leaving nothing but echoes in the dust. The contrast could not have been sharper. One old farmer, his face carved by sun and years, wept openly when a GI placed a tin of meat in his hands. "The others took," he muttered, his voice cracked with disbelief. "You give." That single sentence, carried by rumor and retelling, spread like wildfire through the countryside. The Americans, once feared as conquerors, began to be spoken of as liberators, not because of their tanks or rifles, but because of the food they shared without hesitation. It was not without complexity. Some Italians distrusted the ease with which the soldiers gave, certain that generosity must hide a price. Others worried that such kindness would vanish once the front moved north, leaving them abandoned again. And there were darker murmurs, too, of black markets where rations were traded for favors or sold at inflated prices. War never shed its shadows completely. Yet for many, the daily reality was undeniable. They were eating meals they would not otherwise have had, And their children's laughter was no illusion. For the Americans, the exchange was equally transformative. They had expected hostility, even hatred, but instead they found themselves welcomed into homes, serenaded with songs, offered wine and bread that tasted of gratitude. Men who had cursed Spam 100 times wrote home about how it became part of an Italian pasta dish, transformed by garlic and olive oil into something almost gourmet. Others confessed in letters that they would never forget the way a child's eyes widened at the taste of chocolate, as though heaven itself had been unwrapped in silver foil. Soldiers began to understand that their war was not only measured in battles won, but in trust earned, in proving that they carried more than destruction in their packs. Lucia's skepticism softened in small increments. She began to notice how soldiers lingered not with menace but with shyness, how they blushed when thanked, how they laughed when children mimicked their marching drills. Private D'Angelo, in particular, reminded her of her lost husband in the way he bent down to tie a child's shoe or carried heavy buckets from the well without being asked. She told herself it was only courtesy, nothing more. Yet she caught herself leaving a lantern lit longer at night, hoping he might pass by. In a world fractured by war, even the hint of safety felt like a miracle. Music became the symbol of this unlikely bond. On cool autumn nights, soldiers gathered in courtyards with harmonicas and battered guitars, their songs unfamiliar but heartfelt. Italians joined with their own ballads, voices carrying stories of the sea and the land. The mingling of melodies created a harmony neither side fully understood, but both cherished. In those moments, the war seemed distant, reduced to the background rumble of artillery, while in the foreground rose something gentler, something human. Still, war never allowed its participants to rest too easily. Rumors of German counterattacks filtered south, and civilians whispered in fear that the fragile peace would shatter. What would happen if the Americans were forced to retreat? Would the Germans return, enraged at any who had accepted food from their enemies? Trust, once planted, was still young and vulnerable, easily uprooted by the harsh winds of war. Lucia felt it in her bones each time she heard distant guns, each time her children returned home with sticky smiles. She wanted to believe in the kindness of strangers, but the memory of cruelty was never far. The meaning of generosity in those days became more than the giving of food. It became the giving of dignity, of proof that even in war humanity could survive. For the civilians, a ration tin was not just calories but a reminder that they were seen, that their suffering mattered. For the soldiers, each gift was a declaration that they were more than destroyers, that they could be builders of trust. It was a fragile, precious understanding, born not from politics or orders, but from the stubborn insistence of ordinary people to remain human. One evening, as dusk painted the ruins in shades of violet and gold, Lucia watched her children chase after Private D'Angelo, laughing as he tossed them pieces of candy. She felt the weight of years on her shoulders, the ache of hunger not yet erased, the fear of what tomorrow might bring. And yet, in that courtyard, she saw something she had not dared to hope for, a seed of trust, small but real, growing in the cracks of war. She closed her eyes, listening to the laughter mingling with distant gunfire, and wondered if such fragile seeds could survive the storm that was still to come.